Thanks, Marcia. I don't know if I deserve any of those kind words, but thank you. I acknowledge that we meet on Gumatj land and as the guests of Gumatj people. The land and the people are one, and I pay my respects to the land and to leaders past and present. Now, just as advance warning, I'm not Yolnu, but I will, because of these justice issues, I align myself with the issue of justice, so I might be using words like we and us, and I take a liberty to do that. On Saturday, Jawa told us of Dr. Gallery Yunupingu's image of a picture in 1,000 pieces. Today we'll pick up a few of those pieces. As we pick them up, if you think something's particularly unfair, feel free to say, that's not right, or that's not fair. You're not going to upset me. Bit of background first. The Commonwealth Grants Commission is the body responsible for apportioning the GST revenue between the states and territories. They do that to enable equal service delivery across Australia, assuming an equal starting point. They take account of factors such as small jurisdictions, remote locations, population who have English as a second language, all those sorts of things, and arrive at weighting factors so that they can distribute the money to achieve equal service delivery, assuming an equal starting point. That becomes the money that the Commonwealth gives the states and territories. The states and territories have no legal obligation to spend the money in the way it's been assessed, and that's important. Each year, each state and territory, under a scheme called the Uniform Presentation Framework, reports the spending back to the Commonwealth Grants Commission, who then publish the information. Now, in 2006-7, and you'll understand in a minute why I'm going back to 2006-7, there was a certain range of areas of social justice, disability services, child protection, roads in the bush, all that sort of stuff, which were underspent in the NT budgets as compared to the assessments. The underspending was 522 million out of 1.1 billion in those categories. That got a fair bit of publicity. And why would I'll go back to 2006-7. Shortly after that, the way in which the spending was reported changed so that it was not quite so clear. Now, that led to a Senate inquiry, and Senator Rachel Seward was a member of that inquiry. It resolved on divided lines. The majority view was that the terms of reference referred to the Commonwealth Grants Commission funding formula, and that therefore they actually made assessments and therefore they couldn't make any finding. Rachel and others made a dissenting report, and I thank them and commend them for that. That, working through from there, that pattern of underspending continued through. It reduced a bit, so that by 2009-10 it was only 334 million underspent. And following through, that pattern of underspending continued through into 2015-16. Now, in more recent years, the spending has come up to approximately equal to the assessments. But if you've got a tree and you don't water it, it dies. It doesn't matter how much you water it after it's dead, it doesn't come back to life. And that's how I view that situation. But as a response to some of that criticism, the Northern Territory Government undertook an Indigenous expenditure review and decided that 53% of their spending was in relation to Indigenous people in the Territory. Fine, sounds good. I did a three-stage reverse engineering process to calculate, using Commonwealth Grants Commission specific data, to calculate how much of the spending should have been on Indigenous people. 68%. Difference, 15%, 500 million, give or take, yeah. So, but that's not the whole of it. If you look more closely at some of the items in that spending or underspending, you'll realise some things. It includes, for example, just in passing, for example, spending on jails is classified as 93% for Indigenous people, because 93% of the inmates are Indigenous. I looked, among other things, at the NT Public Service. From 2003 to 2016, the NT Public Service, or the NT population, increased by 21.4%. The NT Public Service increased by 41.7%. The difference, around about 3,000 jobs, 400 million a year, or give or take. And those excess jobs, which were in areas which relate to Indigenous expenditure or Indigenous services, would be classified as Indigenous expenditure. Incidentally, that was based on 2015-16 report by the Office of the Commissioner for Public Service, Public Employment. They haven't been published since, and if you want the 2015-16 report or an earlier report, you have to apply to the office for it. The excess numbers would be Indigenous expenditure. 2017, the Commonwealth Government announced an inquiry by the Productivity Commission into the horizontal fiscal equalisation, the GST distribution. Yothu were one of two Northern Territory Indigenous organisations that made submissions. The other was the Northern Land Council. Pleased to say that it appears to have directed some attention to some of the issues raised. But some of the things that don't show up in that Indigenous expenditure or Indigenous under-expenditure, if you like, is some injustices that aren't immediately obvious. The geographic injustices. The $400 million spent on roads in Darwin when the Central Arnhem Highway is a dirt track. $400 million, so you might cut 2 minutes off a commute. An $80 million boulevard. For what purpose? Something I've not said, all of that I've said before. Something I've not said before is that the Northern Territory Government uses Indigenous disadvantage as a commodity. It goes to the Commonwealth Grants Commission and pleads for money on the basis of Indigenous disadvantage. But we've got these underspending issues. You can get a closed loop. Dollars, underspending, relative disadvantage, more dollars. At the time of preparing with Denise and the board of Yothu Yindi and others, the submission to the Productivity Commission, we didn't have full insights into the Northern Territory Government. We might have had our suspicions, but we now have the benefits of a thing called the Langalant report, a report done by a former Under-Treasurer of Western Australia into the NT government's spending crisis or budget crisis. When you interpret the bureaucratic language, it is chillingly compulsive reading. When the report says, quote, the NT government requires comprehensive change to improve the integrity of the budget process, you can take that as being spending has been completely uncontrolled. It says, the level and duration of expenditure growth restraint proposed is unprecedented across the states and territories. This is the worst government financial disaster in Australian history. And it's only been 40 years since they had self-government. Some other points that Mr Langland made. Up to 99% of expenditure in each budget is unscrutinised outside internal agency review. Agencies set their own budgets. He also says that successive territory governments have adopted a culture of continuous budgeting with significant additional expenditure approved outside the budget process. What that means is, we've set our own budget, but we're going to overspend, so we'll just put in a new figure and get it ticked off. In the bureaucratic language, the current budget process prevents contemporaneous analysis of actual performance in the current financial year compared to the original budget. No comparison to the original budget. If you did that in an organisation, you would be in deep, deep trouble. No comparison back to the original budget. This is a state and territory government with 21,000 full-time equivalent public servants, 39.4% of whom are in administrative and managerial positions. 39.4%. And this is the best they can do. Spending is uncontrolled and unmonitored. When the report says, given the magnitude of the fiscal challenges, returning the budget to balance should be identified as the primary objective. What that means is it is now sink or swim time for the NT. And during all of this, the Commonwealth has stood by, knowing about that since the Senate inquiry of 2008. Done nothing. Changing tack a bit. Yesterday, Professor Mick Dodson told us that participation in policies is a right under the rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, participation in policy, if you're going to be involved in formulating policy, you have to be involved as a full and equal participant from the start. You have to have the initial information, you have to have all the updates, you have to be equally heard. Participation is not being told what the government has decided after the event. To my knowledge, that has never happened in Indigenous affairs, certainly not in the Northern Territory. What does all of that mean? The NT is not fit to run money for the Indigenous people, and the Commonwealth's not fit to set policy. Now, change tack again. What's life like in the bush? Well, first of all, it's not easy. The fundamental reality is that everything costs far more than you would be used to in Sydney or Melbourne or wherever. I mentioned earlier using Commonwealth Grants Commission data, their relative costs, and these were in specific relation to schools, so they're probably more conservative than they are for individuals, but the relative costs, if something costs $100 in Sydney, in Darwin it'll be $121. In anywhere in the Northern Territory outside the four main towns, it would be $191. The stores in remote communities have the diseconomies of scale of being small as compared to, say, Woolworths or Coles or Bunnings or whatever. On top of that, you have freight. Transport is typically by road or air. very expensive. So let's say the costs of living in the bush are in round figures, double that of Sydney. If you take the aged pension as the Australian government's measure of what it costs to not live in poverty, then divide it by 2, add in the remote area allowance of $18.20 a fortnight, and you get some idea. So there you have it. Historically underfunded in the figure of 500 million a year, give or take. That's after allowing for the huge overstaffing in admin by the NT government. The massive infrastructure deficit that was inherited by the Commonwealth, from the Commonwealth in 1978, and that was massive, and can never be caught up because the Commonwealth Grants Commission methodology is to assume an equal starting point. Equal service delivery, equal starting point. Haven't got equal starting points, that remains the status quo, and that applies to that historical underspending as well. And it's not as if the NT government saved the money that they underspent. They're in the worst financial situation of any state or territory in Australian history. Now, this is the context in which government departments put grants into communities. More often than not, they expect local communities to operate the programs or that they want run, or at least they expect the leaders of those communities to be available for seemingly endless consultations about the programs. Now, a government department might come into a community and ask to speak to a particular leader and talk to him. Let's say they sit around a table and there's 3 or 4 of them. Let's say there's 4. 3 of them will have a salary and their travel allowance. 1 will have no pay, the community leader. The government just does not understand. The more you think about it, you realise that they just don't understand. Programs are proposed, developed, approved and dropped on communities, and you've got this poor group of community leaders harried by all this pressure. No preparation, no consultation. Here, run this. Often, at the end of the financial year, there's a big pressure to get money out the door, flurry of activity. And then that money goes to a community and they get it in June. You have to apply to carry it over because you can't spend it before the 30th of June. You have to account for it separately the following year. And then people will say, oh, we want quick reporting on it. And if let's say you've got a small grant, and it might sound quite reasonable to ask for a quick report on it. But typically, and I've been an accountant for 40 years or more, you've got to do the whole audit before you can report on one. So the whole system is captive to the most onerous set of conditions. Might be reasonable in isolation for the small grant, but not when it has that knock-on effect. And on top of that, you get all these pettifogging, that's a word I like, pettifogging. Just be careful how you say it. Program rules. I've known for demands for information to explain things that the bureaucrats want to know up to 18 months after the event. 18 months. What's the point? So somebody can tick a box somewhere on a spreadsheet for some obscure purpose? I'm also aware of requests for information as to every transaction in every activity of an organisation monthly. Pile of paper like this. The reliance of the NT and the Commonwealth on seriously under-resourced communities to deliver their multiplicity of programs is fundamentally flawed, to express it most politely. It's not to say that organisations in communities lack the capacity to do the work, they just don't have the resources or the time. Remember, not paid. Government departments live in their own world. Attending a meeting to defend one's position is not collaboration, it's being in a silo. And that leads to failures of communication, duplication, loss of focus, blurring of objectives. Whereas the community leaders are highly motivated, focused on local priorities, and have very little time for such bureaucratic nonsense. Rather than having programs operate haphazardly, there needs to be a coherent and unified suite of policies that lead to the community's needs being fulfilled. That would require full Indigenous participation and comprehension of the programs with locally determined priorities. Governments concentrate on delivering goods and services from within silos. Not enough on developing the whole of the community. What's required is a regional structure, culturally appropriate boundaries to oversee all programs within the region and all consultations. The directors, as I see it, would be elected to salaried positions with staff to support and advise the elected members. Local government could not fill this role. I can't say that strongly enough. They're ultimately controlled by the minister, and they have roles that conflict with a body such as I've proposed. A body such as I propose would in fact be entirely consistent with the principles for treaties that were outlined by Professor Mick Dodson yesterday. It would eliminate random and uncoordinated consultation. Coming and telling people what you've decided is not consultation. And it would be replaced with something much more effective and productive. They would have unconflicted staff. The staff would not be public servants. Not public servants. Leaders would be saved from the constant worry of balancing commitment to community with the personal income and financial matters that I talked about earlier, that have some support. And what I suggest, what I think is absolutely essential, is that the relevant funding provided by the Commonwealth and the NT should be provided directly to that regional body. Be a vast improvement on the current passing parade of public servants and others who seek to draw legitimacy for their pet projects from consultation. Remote communities need staff who will work with the community for the community's objectives, not interested in being a career move, a box ticked on a planned career path. Staff working for a government department or a local government council can't be expected to represent both their employers and the community. The conflict is obvious. It has to be committed staff direct to the regional authority. If you think that couldn't work, you think you have doubts about the capacity, I'd point you to the Yothu Yindi Foundation. With the board, with Denise Bowden, with a staff of less than 5, full-time, permanent, plus a few occasional volunteers with bits and pieces, plus the wonderful volunteers here at Garma, fulfil the objectives of the organisation, run Garma, and get to put in submissions to the Productivity Commission which influence government policy. And so don't ever let people tell you Indigenous people can't do it. They can. Remember that tree that we planted that died because it had no water? Well, we're planting a new one. That's what I needed to say to you, but there's just one thing I will say. In 2020, the Commonwealth Grants Commission will be reviewing its methodology. It does that every 5 years. I'm assuming that Yothu will be looking to put in a submission, and I encourage any organisation or individual that wishes to do so. Thank you very much.